Hello, everybody. Can anyone see or hear me? Woohoo! We're on. So sorry for the technical difficulties. It always happens. Excellent. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I hope you all have your whiskey ready. I have my bottle here. I know lots of you will have pouches. Very, very excited to have you all here. In terms of what we're going to do today, I thought I'll just do some quick intros and then I'll tell you a little bit about Nc'nean. We can have a taste together. I'd love to hear what you all think. And there will also be plenty of time for questions. So if you have questions as we go, just pop them in the chat and I will answer them at the end. So I'm Annabel. I'm the CEO and founder of Nc'nean. First of all, if you haven't already, please pour yourself a dram, which I'm going to be doing. I'm actually going to have a whiskey and soda, which we call Whiskey 6. If you've got a pouch, just snip the corner off and pour it into your glass. So here is my Whiskey 6, 2 parts whiskey, 4 parts soda. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that's such a great drink as we go. But we always say, just drink it however you like. So whatever your preferred way is, that is the right way. So let me start with, why did I start Nc'nean? Because everybody always asks me that question and looks at me like I'm completely mad at the same time. So really there's 2 sources of inspiration for Nc'nean. The first is that it's on my family's farm, right up on the west coast of Scotland. You can't really be on the west coast and not think about whiskey. And it was originally my family's idea that we could put a whiskey distillery in the farm buildings next to our house. But really, I became passionate about it as I started to look a bit more into the Scotch industry. And whilst there is a fantastic history of tradition in Scotch, which I absolutely love, and is kind of the bedrock of this incredible industry we have today, I also felt that there wasn't enough focus on sustainability, and that there was an opportunity for a new distillery to do things in a bit more of a creative and modern way that would sit nicely alongside what is a very traditional whiskey industry. And so I really set about to create a distillery that could pioneer sustainable production, but also create interesting, innovative spirits and maybe talk about whiskey in a little bit of a different way as well. So I did some research on this. I used to be a strategy consultant in London, I should say. I took some time off from that job and did some research into what this distillery could be back in 2012. And I then decided to leave my job in 2013 to found Nc'nean. And that was 10 years ago. It took us 2 years to raise the quite substantial amount of money that we need to start a whiskey distillery. It then took us a couple of years to actually build it, and we finally started production in 2017. And the key, what I wanted to embed at that stage was as many of the kind of fundamental sustainable principles as we could early on. And so we looked at things like, where's the energy coming from? Where are the raw materials coming from? Where are we getting the water from? What are we going to do with the waste up front? And I'll talk you through a few of those things now, so that you know what you're drinking comes from. And cheers, everybody, by the way. So the first was energy. Distilling is a super energy intensive process. And we chose to use biomass boiler as a renewable source of energy. We chose that because we have commercial timber literally on site, and it travels a mile from the forest to our distillery. So our distillers are also wood chippers. And that's the right solution for us. But one thing I always say about sustainability is that's not the right solution for every distillery. And you'll see distilleries now are starting to use lots of different energy solutions for their needs, which is great. The second is raw materials. Now, single malt uses barley. It's obviously grown on arable farms. And I felt it was my responsibility that we took as much care of those farms as we did of what we were doing and on our own operations. And so I chose to use organic barley. We were lucky enough to work with a master distiller called Dr. Jim Swan, and he described organic barley as an expensive waste of time. And he was right on the expense of it. It is much more expensive than conventionally farmed barley. But I didn't see it as a waste of time, partly because the impact on the biodiversity, the water quality, the soil carbon sequestration on the land that our barley is farmed on is massive. And that to me is really important. But the other interesting thing, and this comes a little bit onto the tasting, is that what we discovered to our delight once we started distilling with the barley is that it contributes to the flavour. And I always compare this to carrots, because everyone's normally had an organic carrot. Organic carrots are more carrotier than a conventionally farmed carrot. And the same goes for our grain. And the organic barley brings this wonderful kind of oily texture and mouthfeel to our whiskey, which if you're drinking it neat, you should be able to pick up, but is also part of the reason why it works so well in a whiskey and soda, because it can stand up wonderfully to the dilution without becoming kind of flat and flabby. So that is our organic barley. The other things are water and waste, which are not talked about so much. Everybody assumes that Scotland has loads of water, which is true some of the time, but I think it's also really important as the climate changes that we are as careful with our water usage as possible. And for that, we dug a very simple solution called a pond. A lot of distilleries are on rivers, and we don't have a river, although abstracting water from a river has some disadvantages anyway, but I really didn't want to use a cooling tower, which would be the other solution. It's very energy and chemically intensive. So we dug a very simple lake. We have one pump that puts hot water in at one end and cold water out the other, and it works extremely well. And the fourth thing was waste. So we actually take a very traditional approach to this. The cows on the farm eat our draff, which is the leftover grains from the barley, and we spread our pot ale on the fields. So that's very easy. And then so we started distilling in 2017. It was fantastic after 4 years of work to finally see spirit flowing from the stills. But of course, in whiskey, you have to wait and wait and wait for the spirit to be mature. But as we were preparing for our launch year, which was 2020, we had to start thinking about packaging. It's a really tricky topic in all consumer goods industries, but in particular in spirits. But we were lucky enough to find what is now our bottle, which is made by a very innovative company in Spain called Estelle, and they had spent 5 years working on bringing 100% recycled glass bottle to market. And you can see it's a little bit greeny. That's because it's recycled. You'll also find some bubbles and other imperfections in it for the same reason. But it has a 40% lower carbon footprint than a kind of normal premium spirits bottle, which would be made with a very low percentage of recycled materials. And the reason for that simply is it's easier to convert glass into glass than it is sand into glass. So we were very, very lucky to find this at the right point in our journey. And so we launched in 2020. This was in the middle of COVID. It was definitely not what I dreamed of 7 years before when I started the company, launching in the middle of a global pandemic, but such is life. And we were lucky that we wanted to do something kind of to help contribute, I guess, positively to what was going on in the world at that point. And we decided to auction our first 10 bottles for charity. So we supported some sustainability charities, our local trust, and also some hospitality charities. And our first bottle went for £41,000, which was a fantastic start to our kind of whiskey selling. And on that note, let's talk about the whiskey and how we make it. So I wanted to create something delicious and light and fruity. And the really two important things to think about from a production point of view, that's the spirit that we create and then the casks that we put it into. So I'm particularly fascinated by the spirit. And I saw a comment from someone that they've also got Huntress available for tasting. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But from a spirit point of view, I wanted to create something that was really delicious as soon as it came off the stills, before it even went into a cask. And we do that by tweaking every single bit of the production process. So for example, mashing, which is the first day, you've milled the grain and then you mash it, which means you mix it basically with warm water. We leave that to sit for an hour. We have the advantage that we can do that because we're small and independent and we're not in 24/7 production. So we're not rushing to get these processes done. And that helps develop the flavor, just like when you're cooking. The second is that we use 2 yeasts in the fermentation process for all of our whiskies, the ones that we're drinking tonight. And that is that helps create a diversity of flavour instead of using one standard yeast, which will just create kind of a smaller range of flavours. And we also ferment for a really, really long time. That's between 64 and 114 hours, which by industry standards is very long. And again, that just helps with flavour development, bringing lots and lots of flavours into the fermentation stage, which really is the key stage. We then distill really slowly, and the shape of our stills means there's lots of copper contact, and that gives us a very pure, clean spirit at the end, combined with what's called high cut points, which is about which part of the spirit run you take. And we're aiming to collect the kind of light and fruity early components of the run. So all of that contributes to this delicious, light, fruity new make. And we then put it into 3 cask types. So in any one bottle of single malt, this is a mixture of many, many casks, but they fall into 3 types. So roughly half are ex-bourbon barrels. Roughly half are what's called STR red wine barrels. So those are red wine barrels primarily from Spain that have been shaved, toasted and recharred. And then we have 2% of sherry, which is kind of like seasoning. So I didn't want a very sherry heavy whiskey, but those sherry flavors just add something lovely to the overall whiskey. What I am not going to do is give you tasting notes, because what I would love to know is what you guys think of it and what tasting notes you're getting. Max is asking what cooperage we use for our barrels. We use a cooperage in the States called Kentucky Bourbon Barrel for all of our bourbon barrels. We use a company in Spain called Jose Miguel Martin for our STR and our sherry casks. And then we use a couple of much smaller brokerages for the kind of experimental casks that we get. And we've done various single casks and special editions in these experimental barrels, which are always fun. So what are people tasting apart from whiskey? What do we think it is? Anyone got any flavours to throw out there? There's no right or wrongs here. Everyone is feeling very shy. Okay, I'm going to tell you what I taste. So I love the citrusy element of our whiskey, and I find that comes out particularly when I mix it with soda. And I also love the fruitiness. So we always talk about those soft stone fruits, so peaches and apricots. Oh, a strong honey element, Rob. I love that. Yes, I agree. Fruity nose. Yes, that fruit I love. Interesting, Max. Yeah, that texture is what I was talking about with the organic barley. It really makes a massive difference. And if you ever get the chance to taste other organic whiskies next to each other, you'll see that texture come through in all of them. And it's really interesting. It's a really interesting comparison to do if you ever get the chance. While you're all thinking a bit more about the taste, I'll also just talk a little bit about yeast. This is very geeky, but I'm really passionate about yeast. And the reason for that is that I drink a lot of beer, and especially the smaller brewers really talk a lot about yeast because it's really important for flavour in brewing. I'm not from the whiskey industry, so my observation when I came into whiskey was that basically we're distilling beer. That is what whiskey is, distilled beer. We don't add hops and so on, but fundamentally we make beer and then distill it. And I couldn't really understand why there wasn't such a focus on yeast in the whiskey industry, because if it's so important to creating the flavour in the fermentation process, why are we not doing it more? So we also run, alongside our normal spirit production, we run these yeast trials. And they're a bit of fun. We use yeast that are created for products that aren't whiskey. So it could be wine yeast, it could be beer yeast. We've used rum yeasts, and we run them through the distillery for a couple of weeks every autumn. And then we just see how they develop in the warehouse. And we've I saw someone say that they had a bottle of Huntress with them, and that's our spring seasonal release. And it's so far been based on those yeast trials. And it's really just trying to, bring a different flavour profile to whiskey, but also just show what can be done with yeast and have a bit of fun with it. And yeah, and then our other seasonal release is called Quiet Rebels, and it comes out, in fact, it came out today, so it's a big day for us. And that focuses more on the people in our business. And I've talked a lot about sustainability from a kind of carbon footprint and biodiversity and waste point of view, but people is also a really important part for us. And that's kind of summed up in our what's called B Corp certification. So you'll see on our website and on the side of the bottles, if you have one, that we've got a little B in a circle. And that symbolizes that we're B Corp certified. And it's a bit like an organic certification, but for doing business as a whole really well. Putting people and planet on an equal footing with profit. And from a people point of view, one of our missions has always been to create jobs in a really remote area of Scotland. So we are really a very long way from any towns or cities right up on the west coast of Scotland. We're not quite on an island, but we overlook the Isle of Mull. And on a good day, when the ferries are running as they should be, it's an hour and a half to the nearest supermarkets and 3.5 hours to somewhere like Glasgow or Inverness, where you might be able to get a flight or a train to somewhere else. And these areas are incredibly beautiful, but over time, they have suffered from things like lots of Airbnbs coming up, lots of retirees coming in, and general kind of reduction in families and in jobs. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was create long-term, sustainable, year-round skilled jobs in this area, because it's incredibly beautiful, but it does need investment to make that happen. And I'm really happy to say we now employ 11 people at the distillery, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in a village where there's only 50 houses, it actually makes a massive difference. So that's just another kind of side to the sustainability piece. I'm absolutely loving all of these tasting notes that are coming in. Orchard fruits, definitely. Shortbread, I love. That's both a great tasting note and a great food. And we've got a few comments on Quiet Rebels. So I've got some Quiet Rebels, Annabel back there. The Quiet Rebel series is fun and is all about the people that make our business. So it's released every autumn. And the idea is that you get your Quiet Rebels bottling in the order that you join the company. So I was first, mine was released a couple of years ago. And I sat down with Matt, who's our blender, and talked about what flavors in whiskey I really loved. And then we design a whiskey around what you really love from the casks in our warehouse. So either by using finishes or the casks that are already in existence. And then we've since repeated that last year for Lorna, who was our first ever employee. She helped us actually with the building phase of the distillery and then trained up to become one of our distillers, and launched today was Quiet Rebels Gordon, so Gordon's our distillery manager. He's been with us since we started production, and they're all really different bottlings because we've made them in completely different ways to try and reflect their taste preferences. And Gordon's he loves a really kind of heavy moorish whiskey, and so his is very heavy on the STR, the sherry, and it's got some reeve salt casks in as well. So super interesting and a fun one to contrast with our normal whiskey. So one more thing. Everyone always asks about the name Nc'nean. Where does it come from? And also how to say it. So we say it Nc'nean, and it comes from Nc'nean, which is the name of an ancient Gaelic goddess. I didn't want to follow what everyone else did and call the distillery the name of the place. I wanted something that reflects really what our mission was. And we looked back in the history books and found Nc'nean, and she was known as a protector of nature and for walking her own path. And that seemed to sum up so nicely what it was we were trying to do, that we picked her to represent us. But Nc'nean is a very long word, mostly consonants, and I didn't fancy typing that 15 times a day. So we shortened it to Nc'nean. And fun fact for you, in Gaelic, Nuc is the female equivalent of Muc. So Muc Donald means son of Donald. Nc means daughter of. I'm going to answer some of the other questions that have come up. Rob asked, are we using a mix of summer and winter barleys? And the answer is no. Generally on organic farms, you don't get a mix of summer and winter barleys. Most of them are just summer barleys. We are now, I should have also said, by the way, that we use 100% Scottish barley as well as it being organic. The whiskey that you have at the moment would have been grown on 10 different organic farms in Scotland, but we are now down to distilling just from 2 farms, which is nice to have that traceability, but also to be able to work with a smaller number of farmers to further improve their sustainability, and measure things like the carbon footprint of the farms. So no, we just use summer barley. Does anyone else have any questions? Have I missed any in the chat? Also, has anyone tried it with soda? And has anyone tried whiskey and soda before? It's an ancient, well, maybe at least age-old recipe, which was, it's 100 years old. People have been drinking whiskey and soda for a long time, but in Japan, it was really popularized in the more recent history, and really helped kind of with the revival of whiskey in Japan. And one of the reasons that I love it is that adding soda water, you're adding a bit of dilution, which brings out lovely flavors. You're also adding carbonation, which brings out other elements of flavor. And it's also a lovely, refreshing, savory drink, which I just find at this time of night is perfect. Yash, thanks for the question on yeast. Yes, we are experimenting with other yeast strains. So every year we do a couple of yeast trials, and we start that before we actually scale them up to the distillery. We basically go on a hunt for interesting yeasts, and we'll ask our existing yeast suppliers. We'll do some collaborations, and we test them literally in buckets first. So we'll take the liquid that normally comes off the mash tun before fermentation, and we'll add yeast, and we'll add new yeast in combination with our existing yeasts, and we'll change the proportions and see how they all perform. And at the end of that experiment, we'll measure both alcohol production, because sometimes it just simply doesn't work, and also taste the wash. It's a bit like tasting beer, to try and ascertain what flavor it's imparted, whether we like the flavor, and how we think that will scale up when we distill it. And some of them are a disaster, and we get rid of them. And some of them are great, and then we scale them up. And so far to date in the warehouse, I think we've got rum yeast, and that was our Huntress 2022, which was delicious. We've got red wine and white wine yeast. Both of those we used in combination in Huntress 23. We've got some brewers yeasts. We've got some champagne yeast. We've got some Swedish farmhouse yeast, Kjevik, Pitchia, lots, basically. A really interesting range, and it's absolutely fascinating walking into the still house during yeast trial weeks and kind of observing the different smells and also the different tastes in the new makes while we're doing it. So watch this space for more coming out. Low wines, yes, there is a range of aged casks, and that's a really interesting question on the bourbon and STR combo. So actually when we launched, we had a slightly different cask mix because of the way that different casks mature over time. STR casks typically mature very fast and then plateau a bit, whereas bourbons are kind of in the opposite direction. So we don't have a specific age profile of the casks in any one batch. We pick the best casks, and that's also why we don't have an age statement, because we like to be flavor driven rather than try to be constrained by it has to all be 4 years old or it has to all be 5 years old. But we, as a general rule, bourbons change more with age, and STRs, once they get to the kind of 4 or 5 year point, start changing less rapidly. But the important one is sherry. We didn't actually have any sherry in the early recipes because they're sherry butts, so they're 500 litres rather than the kind of 200, 220 of the other barrels. And as a result, they mature much less quickly. So we felt when we were launching that they weren't yet ready, so we didn't incorporate them, and have incorporated them later on because we felt they were they were ready. So the sherry component will tend to be a bit older, perhaps, than the other barrels in it, but there are no hard and fast rules. Sam, what are my personal favourite whiskies? That's a very hard question because it very much depends on my mood. But one of the early ones that I really loved was Glenmorangie Atlanta, which is unusual for me because that was 17 years in new oak casks. And I actually don't generally like new oak casks, but that one really spoke to me. I think now that I'm in the industry, it's very hard for me to separate taste from kind of mission and how people do business, as well as what the whiskey tastes like. So I think more about favourite distilleries and philosophies than anything else. But some of my favourites there are Bruichladdich, who I think are doing amazing things in Scotch. They're one of the only other B Corp certified. They're the only other B Corp certified Scotch distillery, in fact. But there's also lots of other small new distilleries very much like us in the Scotch industry and indeed in the rest of the UK. And I absolutely love the kind of collaboration and support that the industry overall gives each other, but in particular the smaller distilleries give each other. So that's really fantastic. And then beyond that, there's also a kind of nice collaboration and group of Jim Swan distilleries. So we were at the Whiskey Show in London this weekend, and we were next to Milk and Honey, who are an Israeli distillery. And they're also a Jim Swan supported distillery. And we're opposite the Cotswolds, who also had Jim involved. So it's really nice to have that kind of international group of Jim Swan distilleries as well. Gentleman Grim, do you have any plans for age statement release in the future? At the moment, no. And that's because really of what I referred to earlier, that I would rather have the flexibility to choose the best casks at the moment rather than be constrained by an age statement. But I never say never. We actually do, as well as our normal recipe that I talked about in the distillery and the yeast trials, we do mature another spirit, which we call Old Recipe. It's not a very creative name. And that is intended to be matured for 10 years or more. So it's a much more traditional recipe. The new make itself, when it comes off the stills, I think is less delicious. It's less pure and fruity. It's got more faults, you might say, in it. But over 10 plus years in a cask, the idea is that those less pure elements will become depth and texture and something interesting. So we're monitoring that very closely at the moment. The oldest is 6 years old now and is showing great promise, and we have yet to decide what we will do with that. We could incorporate it into our normal bottles, a bit like we incorporated 2% sherry to add another element, or we could bottle it completely separately, and if we did, we could incorporate an age statement. But at the moment, I don't really feel a need for an age statement. What I would actually prefer, honestly, is a change to the rules so that we could be completely transparent about what was in each bottle. And you'll see on our website, you can go onto the batch page, and if you have a bottle, you'll be able to see on the back of the neck what batch it is. And what I would love to be able to do is put all of the details on the casks on there, because then the question of age, you will know everything. It's not just the minimum age, it's the whole age. But we're not allowed to do that legally at the moment, but hopefully that will change in future. And I also saw someone asking what batch was in the pouches, which we need to find out. I don't know off the top of my head, but we'll definitely let you know. Rob is asking whether there's anything peated in the pipeline, which is a really good question. And I'm afraid the answer is no. And the reason for that is that digging up peat and burning it is not very sustainable. So we have decided not to do that, although I know there are lots of people who would like to see it. But we're really, it's very core to our mission that we do everything we can to make Scotch as sustainable as possible. And peated, unfortunately, doesn't fit with that. Are there any other questions that I have missed? Maybe earlier on. If anyone's got a question that I haven't answered, please feel free to put it in the chat again lower down so that I can catch it. And I hope everyone is really enjoying their whiskey. Low wines, yes, interesting. That we are definitely considering. Can we do something other than peat to create that kind of smoky flavour? It's on the list. when we'll actually manage to do it, I've got no idea, because there's always too many ideas and too much stuff going on. But I really do like that idea, because there are lots of other ways to create that flavour, and if we could find something interesting, that would be super fun, because I think, you know, peat is a very, very special thing. It takes hundreds of thousands of years to create it, and it's really important for biodiversity. So not digging up is important, but smoking barley in other ways would be really fun. Rob, I'm glad you like Huntress 22. That's the that is the rum yeast one. And what's so interesting about it is that we specifically used exactly the same cask mix, so that you can compare the two, and the difference you're tasting is really just yeast, which I think is so interesting and fun, and not something that is talked about very much in the industry. Oh, Yash, a peated cask release, yes, maybe. It's a tricky one though. Peat's still been in the process. Oh, Max, that's so great to hear. Yeah, really, we're just very happy to be able to share the love with these samples. They're so easy to post out and get into people's hands, and it's a very fun way of doing a tasting. And also, thanks again, everyone, for joining us, because it's a great fun thing to do on a Tuesday night. Has anyone got any more questions? Chardonnay yeast is the taste mecca of yeast, Duncan. Well, that is a strong statement. I actually think Pachia yeast might be the taste mecca of yeast, but that has not been released yet. But keep your eye out. Hopefully, it won't be this year, but maybe, sorry, it won't be 24, but maybe 2025, we might have a Pachia yeast coming out, which is delicious based on the early tastings we've done. Okay, everybody, I think we will draw things to a close unless there's any more questions. It's been wonderful to have you all with us. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your support. Thanks for all the tasting notes. It's been really awesome to see them in the chat. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed the whiskey. If you're interested in trying Quiet Rebels Gordon, keep an eye out for it. It is out today, and it's on our website and through various independent retailers in the UK, and it has had fantastic feedback so far. So thanks again, everyone. Lovely to chat with you. Bye.